Podren dropped the crate on the third step, and every Ithren in the corridor turned to look, because a dropped crate meant a debt, and a debt meant someone had to decide, out loud, in front of witnesses, whether to collect it. YSK watched from the landing above, his ledger gland already warming behind his jaw, the way it always did when a transaction was about to be born into the world. That was what the gland was for. Every Ithren had one, a soft-plated organ behind the hinge of the mandible that read the faint status and every other Ithren carried on their skin, the chemical signature of how much was owed to them, by whom, and for how long. Podren's scent was thin and sour, the smell of a boy who owed more than he would ever pay off in service. Bonded caste. 14 years into a contract his grandmother had signed. YSK did not know the boy personally. He knew his rank the way he knew the temperature of a room, instantly, without effort, the moment he stepped into it. The crate had split along one seam. Loose data spools rolled across the floor plate, clicking against each other, and Podren went down on his knees to gather them with the particular haste of someone who understood that every second on his knees in a public corridor was a second someone might charge him for. Nobody moved to help him. That was correct. That was how a corridor was supposed to behave. If a vested caste student helped, the debt would transfer instantly and formally, the ledger gland recording it before either party had finished the gesture, and Podren would owe that student labor, or deference, or silence, for a season or a year, depending on the market rate for spilled spools that morning. If another bonded student helped, the debt would transfer sideways, which was worse, because bonded students had nothing to spare and the two of them would simply be poorer together. Everyone in the corridor understood this. Everyone in the corridor did the correct thing, which was nothing. Then the new student crouched down next to him and started picking up spools. YSK's gland went cold. Not warm, the way it did for a normal transaction beginning. Cold, the way it did when it could not find a signature to read at all. The new student, human, the announcement 3 days ago had called her, a species newly folded into the confluence, still without a settled place in anyone's understanding, gathered 6 spools in one motion and set them back into the broken crate, then held the seam together with one hand while Podren fumbled the clasp shut with the other. She said something to him, quiet, that YSK's hearing didn't catch. Podren's face did something complicated. Fear, first. Then a kind of confusion that looked almost like pain. He waited for the transfer. YSK could see him waiting for it, his whole body braced the way you brace for a blow you know is coming, the debt tone that would settle onto his skin and tell every Ithren on the station exactly what he now owed and to whom. It did not come. The human stood, brushed off her knees, and walked on toward the lecture hall as if she had done nothing more remarkable than move out of someone's way. Podren knelt there a moment longer with the crate in his arms, staring after her. Then he looked up, and across the width of the corridor, his eyes found YSK's, and YSK understood, without a single word passing between them, that the boy was asking the same question that had just opened up like a fracture behind YSK's own jaw. What was that, if it wasn't a transaction? 3 landings up, a vested prefect named Col Vantessa had stopped mid-stride to watch the whole thing happen, and his ledger gland, YSK noted, had not gone cold at all. It had gone very, very warm, in the specific way a gland warmed when it was cataloguing a threat. YSK had grown up understanding the corridor the way other species understood weather. You could read a hallway on Threnody Station the way a sailor read a sky, who walked closest to whom, who yielded a doorway first, who carried their sense signature bright and confident and who kept it folded small and apologetic against their own skin. It was not cruelty. That was the thing outsiders never understood about the ledger. It was legibility. Every Ithren who had ever lived on this station could walk into any room on any deck and know, within seconds, exactly where they stood and exactly what was expected of them. There was a kind of peace in that, a peace YSK had never once questioned until he watched a 14-year contract boys' crate spill open and a stranger with no sense signature at all simply reach down and fix it. He found himself still standing on the landing long after the corridor had emptied, turning the moment over the way his mother turned river stones on her writing desk, worn smooth from handling, looking for the seam that would tell him what kind of stone it actually was. He did not find one. That, more than anything, was what kept him there past the second bell, watching the space where the girl had been. YSK's own house sat in the mid-ranks of vested caste, comfortable enough to send a son to Threnodi's academy, not so wealthy that a single miscalculation couldn't unravel 3 generations of careful accumulation. He had grown up being taught, gently but constantly, that every kindness he extended was also a kind of investment, that generosity without expectation was not virtue but carelessness, the sort of mistake that separated houses that endured from houses that didn't. He had never questioned this the way he questioned almost everything else, because it had never once occurred to him that it was a thing that could be questioned. It simply was, the way gravity simply was, the way the ledger gland behind his own jaw simply was, warm and cold and warm again, a compass that had never once in his life pointed toward anything but exactly where he stood. That night, for the first time he could remember, it pointed at nothing at all, and he found he did not entirely dislike the silence. Her name, according to the enrollment notice pinned to every dormitory board on the level, was Marin Cole, of a world called Earth, here as part of the Confluence's newest observer species integration cohort. Her file, when YSK pulled it up on a public terminal between lectures, was mostly a wall of restricted fields. Kinship structure, restricted. Resource sharing protocol, restricted. Historical governance model, restricted. 60 years of first contact caution compressed into a page of black bars. Only one field sat open and unqualified, and it was not a field YSK had ever seen used for a species profile before. Cooperative default, unconditional, juvenile extended, non-transactional. He read it 4 times, then pulled the comparison charts the enrollment office had appended below the restricted fields, the standard cross-species reference tables every incoming student's profile carried so that faculty could calibrate expectations. Every other species on the chart had a cooperation index measured against a baseline of kin selection, the biological logic that made an organism more generous toward blood relations than strangers, a logic so universal across the Confluence's catalogued worlds that it had never once needed to be stated as a rule rather than simply assumed as a fact of nature. Earth's line on the chart did not fit the axis. Someone in the enrollment office had left a small annotation beside it, informal, clearly not meant for a student's eyes, that read only, see attached behavioral notes, recommend caution, not hostility. YSK stared at the word caution for a long time, turning it the way he turned everything, looking for the transactional logic hidden underneath it, and found, for the first time in his academic career, that there wasn't one to find. On every world the Confluence had catalogued, cooperation was a market. You gave because you would be repaid, in kind or in standing or in future obligation. Even the softest, most communal species logged the exchange somewhere, in memory if not in a gland. Non-transactional was not a description of generosity. It was a description of an error. It meant the organism gave things away with no expectation of return, to strangers, reliably, as a baseline behavior rather than an exception worth noting. YSK thought of foraging colonies back on the home reef, the ones that failed within a season because some founding matriarch refused to charge her own broodmates for shelter. He had studied them in his 2nd year. They were used as a teaching example of collapse. He did not sleep well that night, which for an Ithren meant very little, since Ithren slept in short vertical cycles anyway, but the not sleeping had a different texture to it than usual, a low persistent hum behind the thought. Someone built a species around giving things away, and then sent one of them here, to us, where giving anything away for free is the single fastest way to be either pitted or destroyed. The next morning, in cultural systems, Provost Thessaly introduced Marin to the room with the practiced neutrality of someone reading a script she had not written and did not entirely trust. "Our newest observer cohort student," she said. "Please extend the courtesies appropriate to a guest without formal ledger standing." Which was Confluence speak for, "She is outside the system, do not try to collect from her, and do not expect her to pay you either." Marin took the seat 2 rows from YSK. She was smaller than most of the room, unplated, soft-skinned, with none of the chitin sheen or crystalline brow ridges that marked out status at a glance among Ithren. She looked, to YSK's eye, like exactly what her open field had promised, something that had evolved to give itself away. At the mid-lecture recess, Cole Van Tessa approached her with the easy warmth of a vested caste student greeting a guest, and asked, with perfect courtesy, whether she would help him carry a case of specimen trays down to the lower labs. She said yes immediately, cheerfully, and picked up the heavier end without being asked. YSK watched Cole's ledger gland the entire walk down the corridor, and it stayed warm the whole time, recording, building a debt that Marin, judging by the flat unreadable calm of her uncolored skin, was not recording at all. By the time they reached the lower labs, Cole Van Tessa owned, by Ithren law, 1 full unit of Marin Cole's labor and goodwill, redeemable at any time of his choosing. She set down her end of the case, smiled at him, and walked away as if she had simply helped a classmate with something heavy. YSK understood, watching Cole's expression shift from triumph to something more uncertain, that the prefect had just discovered the same problem everyone else in the corridor the day before had already half guessed at. You cannot collect a debt from someone who does not know she owes it. Later that day, in the dining hall, YSK watched the same problem play out a second time, smaller, quieter, easier to miss if he hadn't already been looking for it. A bonded caste server, an older woman with the flattened, careful posture of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much space she was allowed to take up, dropped a tray of drinking vessels near the human's table. Half the hall turned instinctively, the way a corridor turns toward any sound of debt about to be born. Marin was on her feet and gathering broken glass into a napkin before the woman had finished apologizing, murmuring something reassuring in her own language that needed no translation to be understood as kindness. The woman's hands were shaking, not from the spill, YSK realized, but from the same species of dread Podren had worn that morning, the dread of a transaction she could not afford, about to be recorded whether she wanted it or not. When it did not come, when the human simply helped and sat back down to her meal as though nothing worth remembering had happened, the woman stood very still for a long moment in the middle of the dining hall, holding her empty tray, looking at nothing. YSK logged none of this in any formal sense. But he began, without quite deciding to, keeping a private accounting of his own, not of debts, but of moments when a debt should have formed and did not. By the end of the first week, the list was longer than he was comfortable admitting to himself. By the end of the first week, YSK had started keeping a private tally, not on his ledger gland, which recorded only formal transactions, but in a notebook, the old paper kind that his mother still used for poetry, because he did not trust the station's data systems not to flag an Ithren who was quietly documenting a foreign student's every social move. The tally was simple. Times Marin Cole helped someone, 11. Times a debt registered, 0. She had walked a first-year bonded student through a broken proof in applied ledger mathematics, the singular joke of a discipline where every Ithren society calculated debt with the rigor other cultures reserved for physics, and not asked for anything after. She had shared her ration allotment with a vested caste boy who had lost his own in a wager, an act so socially inverted that half the dining hall had simply stopped eating to watch it happen, waiting for the punchline, the trap, the moment the true cost revealed itself. It never did. She had spent 40 minutes crouched beside a maintenance drone that had wedged itself under a bench, coaxing it free with her bare hands while 3 Ithren technicians stood by debating whose server's contract technically covered drone retrieval. None of it made sense within any framework YSK had been raised to think in. And yet none of it looked like weakness, either, which was the part that kept him awake. Weakness, on Threnody Station, had a smell. Fear debt, desperation debt, the sour thin note that clung to Podren. Marin carried none of it. She helped people the way a vested elder might distribute largesse at a founding day feast, except that a vested elder's largesse always came home again, compounded, in loyalty and vote weight and favor. Marin's help simply left her hand and did not come back, and she did not appear to be waiting for it to. He found Podren outside the lower labs on the 9th day, turning a small data chip over and over in his fingers. It was, YSK realized, the very chip he'd seen fall from the broken crate. She gave me the notes, Podren said, without being asked, the words coming out fast, like something that had been pressurized. The proof I couldn't do. She wrote it out again from nothing and gave it to me, and I asked her 3 times, what she wanted for it, and she just kept saying nothing, don't worry about it, like it was a small thing, like it cost her nothing, and I don't. He stopped. His gland, YSK noticed, had gone that same cold, unreadable quiet that Marin's own skin always carried. I don't know what to do with that. I don't have anywhere to put it. Put it where you'd put anything you were given, YSK said, though he did not entirely believe his own advice as he gave it. There's nowhere in me built for that, Podren said. There's no shelf for it. It just sits. That evening, walking back from the archive, YSK passed a first-year Ithren struggling to carry a stack of research slates too tall for her arms, one already sliding free of the pile. He thought of 11 separate small kindnesses, none of them logged, none of them costing Marin Cole anything he could measure, and all of them, somehow, adding up to something he could feel accumulating in the corridors like static before a storm. He caught the slate before it hit the floor and set it back on the pile. He did not log it. His gland stayed warm for nearly a full minute afterward, confused, searching for a transaction that was not there to be found, and YSK stood very still in the empty corridor and let it search, and felt, for reasons he could not yet name, something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. He learned more about Podren in those first 2 weeks than he had learned about any bonded caste student in his 3 years at the academy, mostly because Podren, once he started talking, seemed almost relieved to have someone willing to listen without pricing the conversation. His grandmother had signed the original contract during a lean season, back when the family's small trade concern had needed capital and the only capital available came bundled with 14 years of a grandson's future labor. Podren had been 4 years old at the time. He did not remember agreeing to anything, which he pointed out, more than once, with a flatness that wasn't quite bitterness but lived close beside it, was rather the point of how the ledger worked. You didn't need to agree. You only needed to be born into a family that already owed. YSK had walked past the lower deck market 100 times without truly seeing it, but he began, that second week, to actually watch it the way he'd watched the corridor. Every stall ran its own miniature ledger economy, prices quoted not in currency but in favor weight, a fruit seller charging one customer a full unit of debt for a handful of roots and charging another, whose gland red is owed by half the market already, 3 times as much for the same measure, because desperation, on Threnody Station, was priced like any other resource. YSK had been taught this was simply efficient. Watching Podren's face while they walked through it, he began to wonder, for the first time, whether efficient and just had ever actually been the same word. They stopped at a fruit seller stall on the way back, an old Ithren woman named Verity who had run the same 3 meters of counter space for longer than either of them had been alive, and Podren, out of what YSK realized was long habit, offered her the customary greeting debt, a small formal courtesy exchanged before any transaction to establish good faith. Verity waved it off, the way she always did with him, she said, because a boy who had nothing to spare shouldn't be spending it on manners. It was, YSK understood watching the exchange, its own small unlogged kindness, one that had presumably been happening in that exact spot for years before Marin Cole had ever set foot on the station, and he wondered, with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, how many such small mercies had always existed quietly around the edges of the ledger, tolerated because they were too minor to be worth enforcing against, never once questioned as evidence that the whole architecture might be optional rather than natural. She does that for everyone who works the lower decks, Podren said, once they'd walked on. Nobody's ever called it contamination before. I think it only becomes a problem once enough people notice it's happening on purpose. The thing had a shape by the second week, though no one had named it yet. Podren started it, almost by accident. He fixed a jammed locker mechanism for a vested caste girl who'd never spoken to him before, and when she reached automatically for her gland to open the transfer, he said, quietly, the way he'd heard Marin say it, "Don't worry about it," and walked away before she could argue. YSK began noticing the pattern radiating outward from the two of them like heat from a coil. A returned favor with no counter favor logged. A shared meal where no one totaled the cost. A study circle, 7 students, for castes, that met twice a week in an unused seminar room and simply helped each other without anyone's gland so much as flickering. He joined on the theory that he was observing it for academic purposes. He stayed because Marin, halfway through the 3rd session, looked up from a diagram she was struggling to parse, human notation, alien to her as much as Ithren notation was to everyone else in the room, and said, I really don't understand this part, in a voice with no performance in it at all, no strategic vulnerability, no angle. Just a person admitting a thing was hard. Nobody on Threnody Station admitted things were hard without calculating first who might gain leverage from the admission. You give away help like it costs nothing, YSK said to her afterward, when the others had filtered out and it was just the two of them stacking slates. It is not nothing. I've watched you spend hours on people who will never be in a position to matter to you again. Where I come from, we would call that a fatal miscalculation. Marin considered this with the same open, unguarded expression she used for everything, which YSK had begun to understand was not naivety but simply an absence of the layer every Ithren wore from birth. Where I come from, she said, there were a very long time when nobody could survive alone. Not for one winter. You needed people who'd help you even when you had nothing to trade, because someday you'd be the one with nothing, and it would be your turn to need it back. If everybody keeps count, the first bad season kills the whole group. So mostly, we didn't count. We still don't, really. Not out loud. She shrugged, small and human and entirely unaware of how enormous the sentence was. It isn't that it costs nothing. It's that we decided a long time ago it was cheaper than counting. YSK's gland ran warm and warm again, unable to settle, the way it always did around her, and he thought, my people call that collapse. Hers call it insurance. He did not tell her about the notebook. He did not tell her that Col Van Tessa had begun compiling one of his own, a formal one, submitted in fragments to Provost Thessaly under the header Systemic Debt Instability, Observer Cohort Origin, a dossier, growing week by week, cataloguing every unlogged kindness on the station as a symptom of contagion. He did not tell her that his own house elders had started asking, carefully, at family correspondence, whether their son had been spending time with the unranked human. He told her instead that her notation for shared variables was needlessly confusing, and she laughed, and they went back to the slates. The study circle itself had a rhythm by then that YSK could not have designed on purpose. A vested girl named Ithren, whose family ran a shipping insurance concern 2 decks up, spent an hour patiently walking a bonded student through a proof she'd have charged triple for in any other room on the station, and did it while eating with her free hand, unbothered, as though the exchange cost her nothing more than the slate space. Podren, in turn, had started fixing things: a jam chair mechanism, a flickering light panel, small mechanical failures that would ordinarily sit broken for weeks while their owners weighed the cost of a formal service request against the inconvenience of living with a squeak. He fixed them and walked away before anyone could argue about payment, the way he'd learned to from watching Marin do it for a month. YSK began to understand that what was forming in that room was not an absence of value. It was value moving without friction, the way water moved when nothing dammed it, and he found he could not stop thinking about how much of his own species' architecture existed specifically to be that dam. Israel asked Marin directly, one evening, the question YSK had been circling for weeks without ever quite landing on it himself. "What happens on your world," she said, "to someone who takes and never gives back? If nobody's counting, what stops them?" Marin thought about it longer than she thought about most things, turning a stylus over in her fingers. "People notice," she said finally. "Not with a number. Just, you notice. Everybody knows who shows up when it's hard and who doesn't. Nobody writes it down, but nobody forgets it either. It's not that we don't keep track. We just keep track somewhere a ledger can't reach it, and it turns out that's actually a lot harder to argue your way out of than a number is. You can negotiate a debt. You can't really negotiate a reputation for being the person who left." Israel didn't answer for a while. Then she went back to the proof she'd been walking a bonded student through, and did not mention the question again, but YSK noticed she came to every session after that, and never once glanced toward the door the way she had in the first weeks, checking who might be watching her stay. Outside the seminar room, in a quieter and more deliberate register, Carl Van Tessa was building something of his own. YSK saw the early draft once, by accident, left open on a public terminal in the archive, a dossier, formally formatted in the careful cross-reference style vested houses used for trade litigation, cataloguing every unlogged interaction the study circle had produced over 3 weeks, dated, witnessed, cross-indexed by caste. It was, YSK had to admit even as his stomach went tight reading it, meticulous work. Carl had not invented anything. He had simply written down, with total accuracy, exactly what YSK himself had been quietly cataloguing in his mother's poetry notebook, and arrived at the opposite conclusion. YSK closed the terminal without touching the file, and outside the seminar room the count of unlogged kindness kept climbing, unremarked, unrecorded, and entirely, catastrophically visible to anyone who was watching for it. Carl Van Tessa was watching for it. The formal denunciation came on the 19th day, in the Cultural Systems Amphitheatre, in front of the full cohort, delivered with the polished, unhurried cruelty of someone who had rehearsed it. He called it, with careful legal precision, ledger contamination, a term YSK had only ever seen applied to failed colony experiments, dead worlds, cautionary case studies. 7 students, Carl said, gesturing to a projected diagram that mapped, with uncomfortable accuracy, the exact shape of the study circle YSK had been attending for 2 weeks, have begun exchanging services with no debt recorded. I do not accuse them of malice. I accuse them of importing a foreign social pathogen without understanding what it does to a system built on accountability. Every stable society in the confluence's records enforces reciprocity because reciprocity is what prevents exploitation. Remove the ledger and you do not get generosity. You get the strong taking from the weak with no record and no recourse, dressed up as kindness until the moment it stops being convenient. He looked, deliberately, at Marin. I would ask the observer cohort student to explain to this room what, exactly, she intends to gain from a station full of people who no longer know what they owe each other. The amphitheatre was silent in the specific, listening way Ithren silence worked, dozens of glands running warm at once, cataloguing, waiting. Marin stood. She did not look afraid, which YSK had learned by now did not mean she wasn't. It meant only that whatever she felt did not organize itself on her face the way Ithren fear organized on theirs. Nothing, she said. That's the part one don't think you have room for. I'm not owed anything by not asking to be owed. I just, where I'm from, that's not the strange thing. The strange thing would be keeping count. She glanced, just once, toward Podren, toward the study circle scattered through the tiered seats. I didn't ask any of them to stop logging. They did that on their own. Maybe ask them why, instead of me. Nobody asked them why. Provost Thessaly, 3 seats up, made a small precise notation on her own slate, and by that evening the seminar room was locked, formally, under a station directive citing unregulated exchange activity, pending review. Podren's contract holder, informed that her bonded boy had been giving away labour for free, added 6 months to his term as a penalty for what the notice called unauthorised generosity, damage to holder equity. YSK found him afterwards sitting on the floor outside the sealed seminar room, the data chip from the very first week still in his hand, worn shiny at the corners from 3 weeks of turning it over and over. His contract holder, a mid-tier vested merchant named Casseth Oral, had summoned him formally that afternoon, in front of 2 witnesses, the way any legal amendment to a bonded contract required. She had not seemed angry, Podren said. That was the part that had stayed with him. She had seemed almost apologetic, the careful, procedural apology of someone who genuinely believed she had no choice, reciting the penalty clause from a contract his 4-year-old self had never read, adding the 6 months in the same even tone she might have used to discuss the weather on her home world. Unauthorized generosity, damage to holder equity. As though kindness were a resource he had stolen from her inventory. 6 months, Podren said, not looking up. For helping someone with a locker. YSK sat down beside him on the cold floor plate, which was not a thing vested caste students did, and felt his gland flare warm at the sheer social wrongness of the posture, and did not move. I told you there was nowhere in me to put it, Podren said. Now I know why. There isn't supposed to be. They built us without the shelf on purpose. Above them, in the sealed room, the light behind the door's small window clicked off, and somewhere in the station's deep structure, though neither of them could have known it yet, a subroutine that had gone unmaintained for 4 years, because the maintenance contract for it kept getting logged as a debt nobody wanted to owe, quietly failed. The amphitheatre had not stayed neutral after Marin sat back down. YSK felt the room's collective gland warmth shift around him for the rest of the lecture, dozens of small recalculations happening in real time as students who had never spoken to a bonded caste peer in their lives began quietly reassessing whether proximity to the study circle was now a liability worth shedding. Israel, the shipping insurance girl, did not come to the next session. 2 others followed her. YSK noted their absence and said nothing, and told himself it was simply prudent, and did not entirely believe himself even as he thought it. That night, a formal correspondence arrived from YSK's mother, gentle in tone the way his mother's messages always were, and unmistakable in its intent. She had heard, through channels she did not name, that her son had been observed in close and repeated association with an unranked foreign student and a bonded caste boy whose contract holder had just filed a formal complaint against him. She did not forbid anything. Ithren elders rarely forbade directly. It created a debt of obedience that had to be repaid, and a mother did not wish to be owed by her own son. She simply asked, in the careful, load-bearing way of someone who had spent a lifetime learning exactly how much weight a single sentence could carry, whether he had considered what it would cost their house if his name appeared beside Col Van Tess's dossier instead of against it. YSK read the message twice, and did not answer it that night, and lay awake in his short vertical rest cycle turning the question over exactly the way he had once turned over the memory of a girl helping a boy pick up spilled data spools, looking for the seam that would tell him what kind of stone it actually was. The failure did not announce itself as a failure. It announced itself, at 0340 station time, as a soft chime and ascent of ozone in the lower ring, and by 0350 it was a full atmospheric seal breach in 3 connected sections of the maintenance deck, the same deck where the drone Marin had once freed from under a bench still, technically, according to nobody's paperwork, belonged to nobody's service contract. YSK woke to the station's emergency tone, a bone-deep resonant pulse that every species aboard had been conditioned to answer instantly, and his ledger gland, useless in every way that mattered in the next hour, sat cold and silent behind his jaw while the corridor lighting shifted to crisis red. The station's own systems failed the way the ledger system had trained them to fail. Sealed doors on the maintenance deck required an override, and the override required vested caste authorization, and the 2 vested engineers with clearance were both 3 decks away in family quarters, and the intervening comm relay routed every emergency request through a formal service debt queue that had never once, in the history of the station, been tested under a scenario where 40 people were losing breathable air in real time and nobody wanted to be the one who owed the debt of. Jumping the queue. YSK reached the command mezzanine 11 minutes after the alarm, into a scene of pure procedural paralysis. Provost Thessaly stood over a console shouting for authorization codes that weren't coming. Carl Van Tessa, to his credit, was trying, genuinely trying, to invoke override protocol, but the protocol itself required a formal debt transfer from his house to the engineering guild before the guild's automated systems would even accept the command, and the guild's arbitration algorithm, unaware that people were dying 8 decks down, was calculating fair market value for an emergency service request with a patient. Mechanical indifference of a system that had never been asked to move faster than it was built to move. There's no path, Cole said, and for the first time since YSK had known him, his voice had nothing performed in it at all. Every route requires a debt authorization, and every authorization requires someone senior enough to grant it, and there is no one senior enough awake. YSK had spent 9 minutes watching Provost Thessaly and 2 junior officers try every legitimate channel the station possessed, and he understood, with a particular clarity that only came from watching a system fail exactly the way it had been built to, that the failure was not a malfunction. Every safeguard on Deck 7 had been designed, deliberately, to prevent unauthorized action, because unauthorized action was the one thing Threnody Station's entire civilization had organized itself around making impossible. Nobody had ever imagined a scenario where unauthorized action was the only thing fast enough to matter. It was Podren who reached the mezzanine next, breathless, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing on the floor outside the sealed seminar room, and it was Podren who said, into the red-lit silence, the sentence that would later get repeated so many times on the station that people stopped remembering who'd said it first. Then don't authorize it. Just do it. I can't, Cole said. The system requires. Not the system, Podren said. You. Your hands. There's a manual seal release on Deck 7, mechanical, no gland required. I've serviced it 100 times because nobody logs maintenance debt on a part that old. It doesn't ask anyone what they are owed. It just opens. He had learned the mechanism, he admitted later, not because his contract required it, but because 3 years ago an older bonded technician nearing the end of her own term had shown him the old manual systems for free, on her own time, telling him a trade with no ledger value attached was still worth having in his hand someday. He had not understood, at the time, why she'd bothered. He understood it now, standing on the mezzanine with 40 lives narrowing toward a number nobody wanted to look at directly, and he found himself grateful, in a raw and immediate way that had nothing to do with debt, for an unlogged kindness given to him years before he had any use for it. YSK watched Carl Van Tessa, heir to a house built across 9 generations on the precise, unforgiving arithmetic of who owed whom, stare at a bonded caste boy telling him to do something that would generate no record, secure no debt, guarantee no return, and save, if the timing held, 40 lives that would owe him absolutely nothing afterward. YSK had spent his whole life inside a system built for legibility, and he understood, standing on that mezzanine watching Provost Thessaly argue with an automated arbitration algorithm that could not be made to care about oxygen levels, that legibility and speed had never once, in 9 generations, been asked to be the same thing. The algorithm wanted a debt holder of record before it would release a manual override code. It did not matter that the debt holder of record for a 4-year unmaintained subroutine no longer existed in any active roster. It did not matter that people were dying. The system had been built to ask who pays for this before it asked how do we stop this, because on Threnody Station those had always, until this exact moment, been the same question with the same answer. YSK saw, on the secondary display, the atmospheric readout for Deck 7 dropping in slow, patient increments, and understood with a kind of distant, floating horror that he was watching a room full of the station's most capable people fail to save 40 lives not because they lacked the will, but because none of them had ever been trained to act before the paperwork caught up. Show me, Cole said. Deck 7 was already thick with vented atmosphere fog by the time the 3 of them reached it, Podren leading, YSK close behind, Cole a half step back with the particular unsteadiness of someone doing a thing his entire upbringing had no procedure for. The manual release sat behind a panel Podren's fingers found without needing to look, a mechanism built in an older, cruder era of the station's construction, before every function on Threnody had been folded into the ledger's logic. It did not ask anyone what they were owed. It simply required someone to physically hold 2 levers in opposition for the 11 seconds it took the backup seal to engage, which meant someone had to stand directly in the thinning air while they did it. Marin was already there. YSK would never fully reconstruct, afterward, how she had beaten them to it, some combination of the same restless, unguarded instinct that had made her stop for a broken crate on the first day, some early alarm she'd answered while the rest of the station was still routing requests through a queue built for a world where nobody moved before they knew what it would cost them. She had one hand already braced on the first lever, her breath already coming short and visible in the fogged air, and when she saw them she didn't ask for help. She simply shifted to make room, the way you make room for someone joining a task already in motion. No negotiation, no accounting, as if of course they would help, as if there had never been any other possibility. "Second lever," she said, voice thin from the thinning air. "Hold it steady. Don't let go before the light goes green. Doesn't matter what happens." Call Van Tessa, whose gland had spent 19 days cataloguing her as a contaminant, put both hands on the second lever and held. The 11 seconds took longer than 11 seconds ever should. YSK kept his own hands braced against the housing, feeling the whole mechanism shudder as the seal fought the pressure differential, watching Marin's face go tight and pale in a way he now recognized, from 3 weeks of watching her, as pain she was choosing not to spend time on. Podren stood at the panel behind them, calling out numbers from a display only he seemed able to read fast enough to be useful, his voice cracking once on a figure that meant, YSK understood later, that they had come within 4 seconds of the seal failing entirely. The light went green. The seal engaged with a sound like a held breath finally released, and the fog began, slowly, to clear, and somewhere behind them down the long red-lit corridor, other doors were opening the same way, by other hands, because word had gone through the lower decks in the last 20 minutes the way word only ever went through people who trusted each other without needing a reason log for it. Podren's study circle, 7 students become 40, then more, moving through the maintenance levels. Finding every manual override the ledger system had never bothered to secure, because securing it would have required someone to log the debt of doing the work, and nobody, in 4 years, had wanted to owe that. YSK would piece the full shape of it together only afterward, from a dozen separate accounts told to him over the following days. Israel had run the length of the residential ring, rousing every vested student she knew well enough to trust, not to authorize anything, simply to help carry the injured toward the medical bay before proper channels had finished debating who was cleared to move them. Verity, the fruit seller, had unlocked her own stall's emergency stores and handed out breathing masks to anyone who passed, refusing, when someone tried to log it out of all habit even in the middle of a crisis, to let the transaction record. Casseth Oral, Podren's own contract holder, whom nobody would have expected to move a single unpaid step for a bonded boy she just penalized for kindness, had been found 20 minutes later on Deck 5, hauling an unconscious first year twice her own mass toward an open airlock, her ledger gland running cold and silent the entire time, as though for 1 hour some old and buried part of her had simply forgotten how to count. Somewhere in the middle of the 11 seconds, YSK's grip slipped half a finger's width on the housing, the metal slick with condensation, and for one raw instant he felt the whole mechanism start to give, felt Marin's shoulder press hard against his without either of them deciding it, correcting the angle before either of them had time to be afraid of what almost happened. Nobody spoke. There was nothing in that instant that needed a word attached to it. YSK thought, with the strange sideways clarity that came to him only in the worst moments, that this was the first physical contact he had ever had with a member of her species, and that it had happened without either of them calculating what it would cost, and that some part of him that had been braced for that calculation his entire life simply never got the chance to make it. By the time the 2 vested engineers with proper clearance finally arrived, breathless, authorization codes in hand, the crisis they had been summoned to solve was already 3/4 solved by people who had never once asked permission to help each other. YSK sat down hard against the corridor wall, the taste of stale, safe air, in his mouth, and watched Call Van Tessa look at his own hands as though he did not entirely recognize them. The formal inquiry took 4 days, and its conclusions, when Provost Thessaly finally read them aloud to the full cohort, arrived with none of the polished certainty calls denunciation had carried 3 weeks earlier. Deck 7's backup system saved this station, she said, and they were operated entirely by unauthorized personnel acting without deck clearance, in direct violation of 9 separate protocols. She let the silence sit long enough that YSK could hear, faintly, the low collective murmur of 40 glands running warm at once, waiting to learn what they were about to be told they owed, or were owed, for what they'd done. The inquiry finds that had those protocols been followed to the letter, this station would have lost 41 lives to a queue. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. YSK had spent 3 weeks learning that his own species did not build sentences that admitted fault directly. They built silences shaped like the fault instead, and let people stand in them until they understood. In the days between the incident and the inquiry's findings, the station had existed in a strange, suspended quiet YSK had never felt on Threnody before. Corridors that had always carried the low, constant hum of 100 small calculations felt oddly muted, as though half the population were holding a breath they hadn't decided yet whether to release. Medical bay reports listed no fatalities and only 2 injuries serious enough to require extended treatment, both from students who had run rather than waited, and both of whom, YSK noted, were visited daily by classmates who had never logged so much as a shared meal with them before the crisis. Provost Thessaly herself came to the study circle's first reopened session, which nobody had expected, and stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking, the way Col Van Tessa had once stood watching a crate spill open in a corridor. She did not apologize, formally or otherwise. YSK suspected she was constitutionally incapable of it, 9 generations of provostship weighing on the syntax available to her. But she asked, before she left, whether the circle would be willing to submit a written account of how the Dex 7 response had actually organized itself, off the record, for her own understanding rather than the official file. Podren said yes before anyone else had finished considering the question, and YSK noticed that this time, nobody in the room waited to see whether it would cost him anything. The seminar room seal was lifted that afternoon. Nobody announced it. Someone simply found the door unlocked, and by evening the study circle had reassembled, larger now, thick with students from castes that had never shared a table before, and no one's gland so much as flickered the entire session. YSK found Podren afterward in the corridor outside, the same corridor, more or less, where a crate had split open 3 weeks before. His contract holder, it turned out, had rescinded the 6-month penalty within a day of the inquiry's preliminary report, not out of generosity, Podren said, but because the woman had realized, with some evident discomfort, that being publicly known as the holder who'd punished the boy who saved Dex 7 was a debt of its own kind, the reputational kind, the only kind her caste had ever really feared losing. She still hasn't apologized, Podren said. I don't think she's going to. I don't think I need her to, actually. I think I finally found the shelf. He held up the data chip, the one YSK had watched him carry for 3 weeks like something he didn't know how to set down. I gave it back to Marin today. Told her I didn't need to keep it anymore. Not because I paid her back. Because I finally understood that wasn't the point of holding onto it. YSK's own mother sent a second correspondence 2 days after the inquiry's preliminary findings were made public, shorter than the first, and entirely different in weight. She did not mention Col Van Tessa's dossier. She asked, instead, whether the human girl liked river stones, because she had a box of smooth ones from the home reef she had been meaning to send somewhere useful, and it occurred to her that a guest so far from her own world might appreciate something that had traveled a long way to reach her. YSK read it twice, the way he had read her first message, and this time he understood immediately what kind of stone it was. It was an apology that never once used the word, folded so carefully into an ordinary domestic offer that no debt could ever be extracted from it, which was, he realized, precisely the point. His mother had spent her whole life inside the ledger too. She simply also knew, in the specific and private way people knew things they had never been given permission to say out loud, that some of the truest kindness on Threnody Station had always been the kind performed carefully enough that nobody could ever prove it happened at all. Col Van Tessa found YSK in the archive 2 days later, which was, in itself, strange enough that YSK closed the file he'd been reading before the prefect had even reached the table. I filed a retraction, Col said, without preamble, which was not how vested caste students of his house typically opened a conversation. Of the dossier. Ledger contamination. Observer cohort origin. I withdrew it this morning. I saw the notice. I want to know something and I would like an honest answer, not a courteous one. Col sat, uninvited, which was its own small unlogged transgression, on Deck 7, when she made room on that lever without asking whether I deserved to be trusted with it. Did she know what I'd written about her? About all of them. She knew, YSK said. Podren told her the day the seminar room was sealed. Col absorbed this in silence for a long moment, his ledger gland doing the thing it did when it was searching for transaction and finding none, the same searching stillness YSK had first felt in the corridor 3 weeks ago and had since come to recognize, privately, as the closest thing his species had to the sensation humans apparently called hope, though he would not have said that word aloud to anyone yet. My house has run this station's shipping contracts for 9 generations, Col said finally. We have never once extended credit without collateral. It is the entire foundation of what we are. He turned a data slate over in his hands, an unconscious echo of Podren's gesture with the chip, though YSK doubted he'd ever have made the comparison himself. I keep trying to find the flaw in what she did. The exploit. The angle where the unconditional kindness turns out to be a longer, slower transaction after all, one I simply haven't learned to read yet, because that would make sense to me. That would fit somewhere. And I can't find it. I've looked for 3 weeks and there's no hidden ledger under the ledger. She just did the thing because the thing needed doing, and it cost her something, and she didn't ask anyone to make it right afterward. My people used to run failure studies on colonies like that, YSK said. Founders who wouldn't charge their own broodmates for shelter. We were taught they collapsed within a season. Did yours? I don't know, YSK admitted. I never actually checked whether the colonies collapsed, or whether we simply stopped being able to explain them once the counting stopped, and decided that not being able to explain something was the same thing as it failing. He looked at the sealed archive shelves around them. 4 generations of Ithren law built entirely on the architecture of who owed whom. I think I am going to go and check. Cole was quiet for a long moment, turning the data slate over and over in a gesture that no longer looked unconscious to YSK at all, but deliberate, a man testing the weight of a decision the way you tested the weight of a tool before committing your arm to swinging it. My father is going to ask me why I withdrew the dossier, he said finally. He is going to want a number. A cost-benefit he can enter into the house ledger, something that justifies abandoning 9 generations of doctrine in a single afternoon. I don't have one. I have a corridor full of fog and a girl who made room for me on a lever without checking whether I'd earned it, and I don't know how to write that into a column. He set the slate down. I think, for the first time in my life, I am going to tell him the truth, which is that I don't have a number, and that I've decided I don't need one before I know something is right. That will cost you something, YSK said. With your father. Yes, Cole said, and there was no performance left in his voice at all, none of the polished courtroom cruelty from the amphitheater 3 weeks before. I've decided I'm not going to log it. He told YSK, before he left the archive, about the conversation he'd had with Marin that morning, the one where he'd finally apologized. He had gone to her prepared with a formal offer of restitution, the only language his house had ever taught him for making a wrong right, a specific number of service hours he intended to perform on her behalf as recompense for the dossier. She had listened to the whole proposal politely, he said, and then told him she didn't want it, not because the wrong didn't matter, but because turning his apology into a transaction would have missed the entire point of what she'd spent 2 months trying, without ever once saying so directly, to show the station. He'd stood there afterward, he admitted, feeling more unmoored than he had at any point during the actual crisis, because for the first time in his life he had offered to pay a debt and been told, gently, that the debt didn't work that way, and he had no framework left to fall back on except simply meaning the words the next time he said them. So I said it again, Cole told YSK. Without the offer attached. It felt like standing on nothing. I kept waiting for the floor to be there and it just wasn't. And then it turned out I didn't fall. YSK thought of Deck 7, of the half-finger slip of his own grip on the housing, of the floor that hadn't been there either, and the shoulder that had steadied him before he'd had time to be afraid. That's usually how it goes, he said. The station's official record of the Deck 7 incident, filed 6 weeks later, ran to 200 pages, most of them procedural, none of them memorable. But a smaller document circulated separately through the lower decks in those same weeks, unofficial, unlogged, the way everything that actually mattered on Threnody Station now seemed to travel, a simple standing arrangement, adopted first by the study circle and then, quietly, by 3 more, then by a full dormitory wing, that any Ithren could offer help to any other without triggering a formal ledger transaction, so long as both parties agreed, verbally, in advance, that this one was a gift. It had no legal standing. Provost Thessaly had made it clear, in her careful, precise way, that the station's core systems were not going to be rewritten because of one crisis and one exchange student. The great ledger of Threnody Station still ran beneath everything, patient and unmoved, exactly as it had for 9 generations. But in the corridor outside the seminar room, on a grey recess afternoon nearly 2 months after Marin Cole had first crouched down beside a spilled crate, YSK watched a first-year bonded student trip and scatter an armful of research slates across the floor plate, and watched, this time, for different students from 3 different castes reach down at once to help her gather them, quick and unthinking, none of them waiting to see who moved first, none of them pausing to let their glands finish the calculation before their hands were already moving. Nobody logged it. Nobody, this time, even seemed to notice that there was anything left to log. Marin was sitting on the low wall at the corridor's end, where she usually sat between lectures, and when YSK crossed to join her she moved over without a word to make room, the same unthinking, immediate gesture he'd watched her make on Deck 7 with her hand already on the lever. Your prefect apologized to me this morning, she said. Cole. It was strange. He didn't ask for anything after. I kept waiting for him to. He's had some time to think about what he can't explain, YSK said. She told him, while they sat there, a little more about the place she'd come from. Not the restricted fields, not anything a file could hold, but small things, the kind that never made it into a report. That her own grandmother, back on Earth, had once told her that the surest way to know whether a stranger could be trusted with your children in a hard winter was to watch what they did before anyone was looking, not after. That Marin had grown up half believing that story was just something old people said to make hardship sound noble, until she'd left her own world and discovered that most of the galaxy had built entire civilizations on the opposite assumption, and that nobody, not once, in 60 years of first contact, had thought to ask humans why they'd built theirs the other way. I used to think we were behind, she said. No universal ledger, no formal debt tracking, nothing you could point to and call efficient. And then I got here and watched a boy carry a chip around for 3 weeks because he had nowhere to put a kindness that didn't ask for anything back, and I thought, maybe we are not behind. Maybe we just built the part of ourselves that doesn't need the receipt. Can you explain it? She asked. Not a challenge. A real question, the way she asked everything, with nowhere to put a hidden angle even if she'd wanted one. YSK thought of his mother's poetry notebook, the tally he'd stopped keeping around the 4th week, once the number of unlogged kindnesses on Threnody Station had grown too large for any one Ithren to track by hand. He thought of a species that had decided, somewhere far back along a road he would never see, that counting the cost of every kindness was more expensive, in the end, than simply giving it away and trusting the world to give some of it back when the season turned hard. He thought of a colony collapse he had never actually checked the records for, and a home reef full of matriarchs who might, for all he actually knew, have simply been misunderstood. Not fully, he said. But I don't think I need to explain it before I decide it's true. That's the part one couldn't do 6 weeks ago. I think that's the part you actually taught us. Marin smiled, the ordinary, unguarded, entirely unremarkable smile she gave everyone, the one that had never once, in 2 months, cost anybody anything, and asked if he wanted to help her carry a stack of returns down to the archive. He said yes before he had finished deciding to. His glands stayed warm for a moment afterward, searching, out of old habit, for a transaction that was never going to arrive. He let it search. He picked up half the stack, and as they passed the 3rd landing, YSK glanced down toward the corridor floor where, 2 months earlier, a crate of data spools had split open in front of 40 witnesses who had all, correctly, done nothing. A different student was crossing that same stretch of floor now, arms too full, a slate beginning to slide, and 2 bonded caste passers-by reached for it at the same moment without breaking stride, the whole small rescue finished and forgotten before either of them had gone 3 more steps. Nobody's gland so much as flickered. Nobody waited to see who moved first. YSK thought of his mother's box of river stones, still sitting unopened on a shelf in his quarters, waiting for an afternoon soft enough to explain to Marin where they'd come from. He thought of a colony collapse he still had not gone to check the records for, not because he'd stopped meaning to, but because some part of him had already decided, quietly and without a formal transaction to mark the moment, that he no longer needed the old verdict to be true in order to choose the new one. Somewhere behind them, faint and constant under the corridor noise, the station's ledger systems kept running exactly as they always had, patient, precise, unbothered, and running, more and more often now, over nothing at all. They reached the archive together, and neither of them logged a thing.